Marcy Wheeler, thanks for appearing on the UpTake. Tell us about the panel on which you just spoke.
I was just on a panel with a couple people from the ACLU and Julian Sanchez from Cato Institute. We were talking about all of the lack of privacy anymore, given the government's powers to get all kinds of data on us.
Narrate a bit about your reporting in this matter. What have you found? What have you written about in the past few years? What's the most alarming stuff?
Well, the most alarming stuff has come out in the last several weeks as part of the Patriot Act reauthorization. Ron Wyden and Mark Udall kind of just lost it and said they're using Section 215, which is the business records tangible thing, to get something that isn't what it says it is in plain text. And what we think is going on is they're doing pretty significant geolocation. So they're taking cell phone data and developing databases of geolocation of not just terrorist suspects, but probably all of us. And I think what Wyden and Udall are trying to do is get some discussion and some admission of what's going on, but it's all happening behind closed doors right now, and it'll be an interesting fight.
And of course, in this past fall here, there were raids on the homes of peace activists, mostly in Minneapolis, but also Michigan, also Chicago. How does that play in?
Well, in that case, it's not, from what we know, it's not per se a surveillance issue. I mean, it appears to have started from that informant during the convention time frame. And as I said during the panel, that's what the government does to re-up investigations of anarchists and peace activists who otherwise there would be no premise for the investigation. And the raids, the claimed ties to Hezbollah and FARC, it just seems like a fishing expedition tied to the material support statute, made possible by a recent court opinion, a Supreme Court opinion, which basically expanded the definition of material support for terrorism beyond all rational basis, and it looks like Patrick Fitzgerald decided to use that expanded definition of material support to go after peace activists.
Contextualize this for us, the Obama administration compared to the Bush administration.
There's not much difference between them, and that's the unfortunate thing. Obviously, we know Obama didn't prosecute the the Bush administration for illegal wiretaps, for torture, but beyond that, and beyond the fact that Obama's using more drones and using illegal wars and what have you, the way the surveillance stuff works is it's just there's new technology, it's new toys, and nobody is saying no to using the no toys, and nobody is weighing, do we really need these billions of dollars of surveillance to capture 10 terrorists? Is there a better way to do this? And it's kind of like it's this gigantic technological kid in a candy factory thing going on without a discussion, because it's secret. There won't be a discussion about whether it's adequate, whether it's appropriate.
What needs to happen in Washington or on blogs or in the national discussion for this stuff to be talked about, to be analyzed, to be questioned?
Well, I think people need to understand how much surveillance the government is doing, and the fact that it's picking up completely innocent people. When that happens, I think we'll have a little more political. One of the reasons they just passed the Patriot Act without any discussion is because they know if there's a discussion, not only do we get inklings of what's really going on behind the curtain, but people do object to it. If there were a public discussion about it, people would object to it. And so, we need to insist that that's going to happen. I think short term, the government released new investigative guidelines for the FBI, and they make really bad guidelines even worse. One of the 2008 guidelines allowed investigation of people for their political views if there was some other factor, and that's the kind of thing that could have been the case for the Minneapolis peace activists. It became okay to say, well, we think they might have, they're socialists, right? We think that their socialist ties might mean that they're supporters of FARC who are socialists. It was that kind of logic, but they've made it worse by making it a lot easier to wiretap not wiretap Americans, but to do database searches on Americans with no record, prone to abuse, and a bunch of other really crummy things. And I think on that one, it'll be interesting to see whether we can get some energy around that, because it's pretty crummy.
Can one make the case that Osama bin Laden is dead, Al-Qaeda is reeling, the war on terror might perhaps be nearing an end, at least contrasted with what it was like in the past decade of the United States, and thus this kind of police state mentality could end?
No, not anytime soon, because what's happening is, since we've killed Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, since they've largely been destabilized overseas, the government says, and they're, to some degree right, although there's a whole lot of underlying issues here, they say the big threat is from self-radicalized people here in the United States. And so that's where all this surveillance comes into play, is they find somebody who's got ties to Sudan or ties to Pakistan, and they start following this person and sending out informants and kind of framing them. And so they're going to continue to make terrorists where there are none until such time as we're able to take a step back and say, actually, Islamic terrorists are no bigger threat at this point in the United States. This may be overstating it, but no bigger threat in the United States at this point than right-wing terrorists. And we're not invested. We refuse to use these tactics with right-wing terrorists because that would be political. That would be attacking people engaged in political speech. Well, that's where we need people to understand, is that ultimately a self-radicalized Islamic American kid is not that different from a self-radicalized right-wing terrorist. So,
is it paranoia or money and financial interest that's driving this police state industry?
Both. It's paranoia, it's money. It's, we as citizens, I think the other thing we need to do is we need to point out that, in fact, climate change is a bigger threat to us at this point than terrorism. If you look at all of the climate change-related disasters this summer and how much damage it's doing and how many people are dying, that's a much more immediate, urgent threat than terrorism. There are lots of, frankly, the bankers are a bigger threat to us right now than terrorism. And so what we need to do is reframe the priorities. And if you're going to fight climate change, I've written about this a lot. Frankly, one of the ways to fight climate change is to make our community more resilient. And that would help defend against terrorism and climate change. And arguably, it might help the economy as well. And so that...
Explain. How...
Well, for example, rather than trying to hunt down every teenage Muslim kid who might be reading crazy stuff online, wouldn't we be better off making sure our bridges have been reinforced recently? Because a bridge is going to better survive a flood if it's been maintained than if it hasn't been maintained, as most of our, here in Minnesota, you know that better than anybody. And there's a lot of examples like that where, I did the state of Pennsylvania was investigating anti-fracking activists as a threat to Homeland Security. And this came out at the same time that this PG&E pipeline exploded because PG&E was playing games with the maintenance. Why, PG&E is a bigger threat than these anti-fracking activists, and that's the kind of thing we need to show. We also need to show that they've wasted trillions of dollars on the war against terrorism, and the payoff hasn't been that big except for the contractors. So, that's the paradigm shift that we have to happen, and we're not close to it yet. But I think climate change is a big one. I think it's going to be harder and harder for people to deny climate change when tornadoes are mowing down their constituents on a regular basis.
Thank you so much for connecting those dots. Anything else you want to add?
No, thank you. You guys do great work. So thanks to the UpTake.